From Wondery, I'm Stephen Johnson, and this is Fighting Coronavirus. Just a few days ago, when I talked to Dr. Bruce Gellin for the first episode of this series, I was recording the conversation from a closet in our Brooklyn apartment. But now I'm speaking to you from the basement of a house in rural Virginia. My wife and I relocated here earlier this week with our kids. And now we're in the middle of the 14-day quarantine recommended for people who leave New York. But as a New Yorker, now being somewhere this quiet, this devoid of people, it feels strange. When we walk our dog along the road, we see maybe 3 or 4 people a day driving past us in their cars. It's reminded me again just how many points of connection city life creates over the course of an ordinary day. To friends, neighbors, strangers. It's been more than a month since I did something as simple as grabbing dinner with old friends, which seems almost miraculous to me now, like some lost tradition from a vanished civilization. But having people in close proximity to each other isn't just about the emotional connection of sharing physical space with other people, as delightful as that sounds right now. Civilization actually needs groups. It needs crowds. This has actually been a theme running throughout many of my books, that this kind of density drives new ideas, new collaborations, new social movements. But, as we're now seeing, density creates danger as well. Today on Fighting Coronavirus, we've got the perfect guest to help us wrestle with the questions of what urban life might look like when this is all over. Richard Florida is one of the world's leading thinkers on city life. He's a professor at University of Toronto's School of Cities and Rotman School of Management, and a distinguished fellow at NYU and Florida International University. He's the author of the classic book of urban economic theory, The Rise of the Creative Class, and more recently, The New Urban Crisis. He's looked closely at so-called superstar cities, those dense, globally connected, expensive cities around the world, like New York and London, which have become particularly vulnerable during a pandemic like this. Last week, on the Brookings Institute website, Richard co-authored a 10-point plan for how he thinks cities can reopen safely after this crisis has passed. Richard Florida, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things I just want to do with every guest on this program is start with the question that we're all asking each other when we talk to friends or family, like, how are you doing? Like, where are you? Like, what is your kind of day-to-day life like right now?
Well, I've been on sabbatical and was actually working on a TV project on cities. So we'd spending it at our apartment in Miami Beach we have 2 little kids. We had kids late in life, or I had kids late in life, a 2-year-old and 4-year-old girl. And look, I mean, like anyone else, I think this has come to a complete shock to my system. I found myself incredibly anxious. I'm not a very anxious person, but incredibly anxious, less about my own health and well-being, thinking about, with kids, what they have to go through. And thankfully, this virus, in contrast to others, doesn't take kids. My regime really is talking to folks like you, writing, and then talking to mayors and city leaders about how they can respond in the intermediate term. So I think things are settling down. We feel a little better now, but I'm sure, like many people, we're incredibly anxious.
The cities thing is obviously why we wanted to have you as one of the first guests on the show. I mean, you've spent your whole career writing about cities, about their importance, the importance of density, the importance of cities to our creative health and our economic health. And that's one of the things that's so, striking right now, particularly right this week with New York City getting hit so hard. Cities, urban areas are obviously in the crosshairs with this pandemic. Let's just start with a little bit of background of your views on this. I mean, what is it about cities that are so essential to a society and why we should be worried about them in this kind of situation?
Look, I think if you look back through the history of cities and health and pandemics, Urbanization has prevailed. The Black Plagues, the London cholera epidemic, more recently, the Great Spanish Flu epidemic of 1918. As an urbanist, I never really thought about them. I know you have, but I had not really thought about them. I had thought about the force of density, the clustering of people and talent. And it's very interesting to me that if you look at our history of cities, our cities have been consistently shaped and reshaped, built and rebuilt in light of challenges to their physical security, like marauding gangs and bands and militaries and armies, but also in response to health and sanitation. Our early building codes that required ventilation and sanitation, the emphasis on green space, the City Beautiful movement. I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. The Pittsburgh Renaissance was because Pittsburgh's air was filthy and it had inadequate sanitation and flooding that caused disease and illness. So it's only now, coming full circle, if you will, 30 or 40 years into an academic career that I see public health and safety. But I think the main message, my takeaway is this will impact our cities in the short run. But in the long run, cities and urbanizations win. But this is going to cause a lot of changes, not only in how we respond at the local level, but also it's going to cause some changes in the way our cities are designed, in our way our cities are organized, and the way our cities go forward.
I find myself thinking a lot about the kind of months after 9/11, and I did a little bit of writing at the time about density and terrorism, right? Because in some sense, the main cause of mortality in 9/11 was the density of the Twin Towers. Part of my thinking at the time was, living as a New Yorker, we'd had this incredible decrease in crime over the preceding, 11 years or so. And we'd fought so hard to make the city feel safe. And here it was feeling terrifying all over again because of this attack. And I think we're about to go through that wave again, even as we get out of this crisis, that there's going to be this kind of the fear of density is going to come back for a while at least.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I think your analogy is exactly apt. As you know, at that time, many New Yorkers were saying, the hell with this. I'm going to move. I'm not going to expose myself, particularly people who lived in lower Manhattan, as it was reviving in the Village or Tribeca or Soho. If you look at the decade from 2000 to 2010, and then from 2010 to 2020, the urban revival, the velocity and ferocity of that went on steroids. Now, what I think will happen after this event will be different. I think we're going to see two scales of adaptation. On the one hand, I think that the superstar cities' role in the world economy will be strengthened. I think the change will come. Many of what's happened with our cities, and I think caused so much of the housing affordability problem, is that rich people who are retired, who've made a mint, who have money stocked up in suburban houses, have flowed back to city for their amenity value. I think those folks are the folks who are likely to say, the heck with it. You're already seeing people barrel out to the Hamptons and barrel out to the Jersey Shore and all the equivalents in between. I also think that if superstar cities' position is reinforced, and we continue to see this spatial inequality between them, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, the tech hubs, the Seattles, the Bostons, and the rest, the heartland cities, I think we will see some modifications in the nature of the relationship between our cities, our suburbs, and our rural areas, what I would call the microgeography. If the first is the macrogeography, the second's the microgeography. And there, I think you may see this accelerated movement to places at the expanse of metro areas, because people can do remote work. So I would see this back to rural areas at the edge of cities movement really accelerating in the wake of this. So I think it's going to reconfigure. And that's what's happened in the wake of previous pandemics. It's not that London and New York or other great cities have lost their place in the world system. It's that the nature of the way those cities and their suburbs were designed has changed. And I think that's what's going to happen again. And that's harder to predict.
One thing that really struck me is you had a tweet a little while ago that said that the reality is we'll not simply press a reset button and go back to normal. Pandemics like this have a 12 to 18 month cycle. Are you seeing this as a 12 to 18 month cycle in terms of the public health cycle of it all, or is that an economic cycle, or is it both? Like, how did you get to that kind of time frame?
Oh, can we take a pause? A 4-year-old has just appeared in my room. Hey, sweetie, I'm working right now. Okay, we'll come play in a minute. It's really cutie. Can you close the door?
Yeah, I love you, Dad.
I love you too, baby.
That is the best part of the interview. That's the part that's going to go viral. That's
So Stephen, to respond, having not known much about the Spanish flu pandemic, except hearing about it, it was pretty clear that there were waves of that pandemic. There was a spring wave like the current one. There was then a fall and winter one. And when I read the histories and read the epidemiology, it looks like, either until we develop herd immunity or hopefully we develop in the modern day can develop some therapies, better therapeutic regimes or a vaccine. It looks like about a 12 to 18 month adjustment period. And it's not like we're just going to go outside one day and say, oh, it's over, life's going to go back to normal. We're going to be scared to death. Like when I go out for a walk in the morning, I've never seen Americans in masks. I see Americans in masks. I see people wearing one rubber glove on their right or left hand, depending on which side is dominant. I see people standing in a queue, socially distant. I see people walking away from one another. I'm not going to send my 2 and 4-year-old back to preschool as usual. My friends aren't going to send their kids back to jam-packed college dormitories and dining halls. I'm not going to go see a sports game in an arena. I'm not going to travel on an airplane unless it's made safe.
I also want to talk about a couple of things that you've put out over the last couple of weeks, including something that just went out in the last couple of days. This new 10-point plan that you've released working with folks at Brookings for cities, kind of the recovery period in the wake of COVID-19. And we'll be sure to share a link to that. But I wanted to look at a couple of those points. It was a fascinating document. And one of them was the airports, because that is going to be so crucial, and particularly in these, major metropolitan areas that are getting hit the worst, that are so dependent on the flow of kind of international travel. That was, one of the things that Cuomo was talking about the other day, in his daily sermon, which I now is a total appointment television for me. I sit down and I literally cry when I watch it. Like at various points, I find myself like watching a PowerPoint presentation and tearing up at the same time, which has never happened before in the history of my life, for sure. But talking about, hey, look, why did New York get hit so hard? And it's like, look, we're a place where people come from all over the world. Like that's our kind of strength is also our vulnerability. So getting those, air transit hubs in a place so that they can work and people can feel safe again. I think that was actually your first point in the plan.
What happened in the wake of 9/11 with the plastic baggie or stuff in the plastic baggie and TSA, it's going to look very modest compared to how we're going to have to retrofit airports. I mean, we're going to have to get temperature screens. We're going to have to do health screens. We're going to have to do line spacing. We're going to have to reconfigure the waiting areas. We might have to run planes at partial capacity for a while with middle seats open. And now you can think about that. What do we do with dormitories? What do we do with classrooms? And play it out. What do you do with arenas and stadiums? What do you do with bus and subway stations? What do you do with streets and bike lanes? What do you do at parks? And that's what I tried to do in this 10-point plan, to play that out. What would be the set of very low-hanging fruit adaptations, like painting lines and circles for physical distancing, rearranging tables in a restaurant so it can reopen safely, making sure everyone's wearing a mask if they're in a crowded thing, and what are the harder ones that you're going to have to do in something like a college dormitory or an arena? So those are the things I think that city leaders, city mayors, urbanists have to think about, because it is going to imprint itself on our daily life over this next 12 to 18 month period until we then, a generation later, we forget it again.
I also want to talk, because of your background, because of the creative class whole idea that's so central to your career. One of your points is talking about protecting the arts and the creative community. And tell me a little bit how you're thinking about that.
Well, I think there are two pieces of our economy and our urban economies that are terribly at risk. The arts and cultural and creative economy of galleries, music venues, cultural institutions, theaters. And the other related part, which is another piece, but I think we can put them together, are the Main Street businesses, the stuff that Jane Jacobs wrote so eloquently about, the local hardware store, now the local juice bar, the local coffee shop, the local bar. Now imagine New York City or San Francisco or Dallas, whatever great city, coming back in X months with virtually no retail businesses on the streets or 50% reduction, and an arts and cultural and creative economy that's been devastated. I mean, that to me is apocalyptic. So what I said is that yes, we have to ready the airports and vital infrastructure, but we need some SWAT teams now. Our philanthropies are mobilizing to provide supports to the arts and cultural economy. And the Small Business Administration in states are readying loan packages for small business. But they're the folks who are not going to know how to reopen. The airport authorities, the arena people, they're going to figure it out. So I was suggesting that chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, and one place to start, for folks listening in, for retail workers, for people in arts and cultural institutions, protective gear, and then what are a set of procedures, health and safety procedures, adequate spacing for physical and social distancing, health checks and screenings that can make us carry on. So I think a two-pronged approach, financial assistance in the short term, technical assistance and management assistance of how to prepare to reopen safely in the medium term.
The other things in the 10-point plan that I thought was interesting and somewhat counterintuitive, and you kind of alluded to this in the opening minutes of our conversation, is this idea of embracing telework. Maybe that's something that we can kind of strike a balance where we still have people living in or at the edges of big cities, but they're spending less time commuting into work. Is that the general idea?
I think that both people and businesses are going to find that this remote work thing works very well. I think there are certain communities that can take advantage of remote work. In the past, most communities have tried to recruit company offices, the great Amazon HQ2 boondoggle that we saw a couple of years ago. I think that game is over. I think that what you could imagine, and I've been working with the Kaiser Foundation in Tulsa and learning a lot about Tulsa, they have an initiative they call Tulsa Remote. They offered a $10,000 stipend. If you would come to Tulsa, they would connect you locally, help you find a house, help you build a community of civic and social capital of like-minded others. They've had tens of thousands of applications, people streaming in from San Francisco and New York and Boston and Chicago. And when I go there, it's like a diaspora from all these cities, I think that certain communities have this opportunity, and you could imagine smart communities like Tulsa going and saying to Amazon or Google or Microsoft or whatever, Disney, we don't only want individual remote workers, but you probably have a group of workers who are scared, right? We were talking about this with regard to 9/11 or now. They don't want to be in the big city. They're scared of density. Why don't you have them consider Tulsa? And we'll house those workers and we'll set them up and create a great life for them. So I think that's one. The other one is, I think, education. What if our universities and colleges can't open? Yeah, we can do online learning, but they're going to be bored to death. Could we create some kind of AmeriCorps that would help regain some civic and social capital and get away from this nutty, overly individualistic society? So I wonder if out of this, not only with a trend to remote work, but with a trend to remote education, that people will be teleworking and educating online, but some ways to help stitch them in and weave them in and make them more a part of the communities where they live than the communities where they work or learn.
I find that very interesting as the father of a high school senior who's trying to decide where he's going to go to college next year. And so we've been thinking, will there be a college next year? So that's a fascinating idea. One of the things I keep coming back to is what you were saying about teleworking. We were in Brooklyn until a few days ago, and now we're kind of in rural Virginia, basically on 14-day quarantine, which we have to be as, emigres from New York. I do think what you're saying about work is, like, one of the things I've always said to people who do have kind of traditional office jobs is, I spend almost no time having meetings, and the liberation of not going in and having, an hour-long meeting where we're watching somebody's PowerPoint, it just is an incredible time suck. And I wonder if maybe that people will realize that they've been wasting a lot of time in those kinds of face-to-face encounters, and they should savor the more important face-to-face encounters for things that are really valuable. So hopefully that's one thing that will come out of it.
What I think is going to happen is this is really going to reinforce inequality.
Yeah.
People who work in personal and business services, who are on the front lines of this, can't work remotely. And moreover, these are the people who don't have the incomes to support a semi-quarantine life. They can't afford delivery. They can't afford a Peloton. I can go on and on in these silly terms.
Yeah.
So I think the inequality that we see today with regard to money, with regard to educational attainment, with regard to the advantages, those of us who have education, we don't have to be super affluent, and some monetary resources can give our kids. This is going to be magnified. And I think it's going to be something that we really need to address in our society. I do think remote work is far more efficient. You know, Paul Graham, the great venture capitalist, the brilliant venture capitalist and founder of Y Combinator, wrote this brilliant essay called Makers and Managers. And he said, you know, if you're a manager, you schedule your time in blocks of every 15 minutes or half an hour. If you're a maker, you need to be away from people minimum for a half day, more like a day. And for me, I don't know if you're the same, Stephen, but if I'm writing, I need to be away from people for more than a day. I need a day just to start thinking. You know, I need like a week of quarantine to write something interesting. So yeah, I think it's going to prove for knowledge work to be far more effective, but I think it's going to reinforce, I think the inequality that we see in our society today, both on an economic level and on a geographic level where we live, that's going to be magnified by this crisis.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about, which I haven't seen that much written about to date. You know, one thing you and I have both talked about in the past and both written about is the relation between cities and political values, and that effectively, you know, it's not, you know, blue states and red states. It's blue cities and suburbs and red kind of exurbs and rural areas. That's the way that the country is really divided up now. And it occurs to me that if, you know, we still don't know how this is all going to play out, obviously, but if indeed the pandemic tends to disproportionately affect dense urban areas, we may get to a point in November, assuming there is an election on time, where folks who are living in rural areas or in exurban areas simply haven't had the same experience that folks living in cities have had. And so that will then be refracted through, you know, an entire kind of political lens, and the sense that, oh, the Democrats were just making up a big deal about this and it wasn't such a big deal in my community. I don't know what the problem was. That's going to create a whole new kind of city versus country political divide that was already, you know, kind of tension in the country in 2016.
Yeah, a great potential tragedy of this, political tragedy, is that this is going to refract and reinforce our political divide, exactly as you say. And, you know, I've been tweeting like mad about this. I think Trump is already setting it up. I think he's a genius. You know, he's dysfunctional in every sense of the world in terms of managing or being an effective executive, but he's a genius of reading the political popular mood. And I think he's already setting up the blue state mayors, the blue state governors like Cuomo and Newsom, who are heroes. You know, I have such respect from them now. And saying, look, I wanted to reopen the goddamn economy. These mamby-pamby, weak-kneed governors listening to these, I'm making air quotes for folks, expert public health weenies, destroyed your pension, destroyed your IRA, killed your job in the retail shop, killed your job in the factory, put you on the poverty line, exposed your family to financial ruin, and this wasn't a big deal. And I think he's setting it up. It will cross the dimension of blue and red. And I think that people on the conservative side, and particularly our president, President Trump, this is going to be the re-election issue for him come fall. I wanted to save our economy. You guys were too concerned with public health. It wasn't as bad as you thought because everything that the blue states did worked. You know, it didn't work perfectly, but it worked to mitigate this. I'm going to blame you for the tanked economy, and my constituents stand behind me. So I think you're 100% right on that.
The one thing I'm hopeful about is that, as opposed to 9/11, where we partially started this conversation, the enemy in this situation is not a human being. It's not another nation. It's not a terrorist group, right? The enemy is a virus. And our weapons are the weapons of public health and social safety nets and people coming together to collaborate on trying to solve a problem and flattening the curve together. There's also an opportunity here for us to all have a reminder of the importance of things like public health institutions. And maybe that's the upside of it.
I certainly hope so. I can see, though, you know, we've already heard words, Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, Asian virus. So what I hope comes out of this is that Americans realize that the federal government is dysfunctional and can't get anything done. The people who are saving our collective asses are local responders, mayors, city leaders, governors, philanthropic organizations, parts of our private sector. I mean, my hope would be that we realize that we're a country that's different. If we reduce the scale and scope of our federal government And we up the relative strength. We use this instrument that we've been given called federalism, our federalist system. It doesn't mean we take all power away from Washington, but we up the relative strengths in states of cities. And then we say we can exist together. That's my hope, that we begin to see this federalist instrument as something that we could better use to live with our differences. And I don't think those differences are horrifyingly terrible. They just get magnified through the refractive lens of national politics. People can live reasonably well side by side in different communities and exist with one another. So that's my hope coming out of this. We'll realize that federalism is something that we can use to our advantage.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for chatting with us. It's fascinating as always, and thanks again for being on the show.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure being with you.
Stay safe, my friend. From American Innovations, this is Fighting Coronavirus. New episodes come out every Tuesday. If you want to help share our series with others, please tell your friends to subscribe and give us a 5-star review. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and every major listening app, as well as at Wondery.com. Also, we want to hear from you. What topics do you want us to talk about? Do you have stories that you want to share from your experience? You can email us questions, or even better, email us a voice memo with your question or story at fightingcorona@wondery.com. That's fightingcorona@wondery.com. This series is hosted and produced by me, Stephen Johnson. It's also produced by Natalie Shishot and Michelle Lands. Executive producers are Jenny Lauer-Beckman, Marshall Louie, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.